Being a young democracy is never easy, and I think it's important to be clear on that. I mean, stability does take time. There are mixed opinions on all of Nigeria's democratically elected presidents since 1999. I mean, why wouldn't they be when development has been stunted to the point where we are literally the poverty capital of the world? In this episode, we're going to be analyzing all of Nigeria's presidents since 1999. Their scorecard is for you to decide. I'm Layla Johnson Salami, and you're watching Polity. Number 1, President Olusegun Obasanjo, or OBJ as he is fondly called. Not to be confused, by the way, with General Olusegun Obasanjo, one of Nigeria's military leaders in the 1970s. It's actually the same person, don't worry, we just have a knack for rebranding and recycling our leaders, OBJ, Buhari, and many more players. Musical chairs, remember? Following the assassination of General Murtala Mohammed, Obasanjo came into power for 3 years. And if you've watched the very first episode of Polity, we've spoken about Obasanjo before. He was Nigeria's first military ruler to hand power over to a civilian government, and that was in 1979 when Shehu Shagari became president. And after this, Obasanjo was very critical of subsequent military regimes that followed. He also started his own organization. He had ambitions too for the post of the UN Secretary General, which didn't go to plan, and he allegedly plotted a coup against Sani Abacha, Nigeria's last military leader, which by the way saw him get life in prison. This was later reduced to a 15-year sentence thanks to friends in the international community like Nelson Mandela and Jimmy Carter. But when Abacha died in 1998, Obasanjo was released from prison and returned to life in politics. And what did he do next? Well, he decided to run for president. Some saw him as a front for the military elite, and others saw him as a freethinker and a nonconformist. Anyway, he ran under the People's Democratic Party and won the 1999 elections with 62% of the valid votes that were cast. This was challenged in court, by the way, by Obasanjo's main rival, Olufalaye, of the Combined Alliance for Democracy and All People's Party, who claimed that Obasanjo and the PDP had bought votes. So, Obasanjo gets into office, and right at the top of his list, as you can probably imagine, was to create an enabling environment for democracy to thrive in Nigeria and to attract credibility and investment. So his administration got to work during the first term on a number of measures attempting to address the energy crisis in Nigeria, coming up with a poverty alleviation plan, suspending contracts that they couldn't defend, pretty much just trying to get some level of political stability into the polity. I mean, there were some developments on record, like an increase in workers' salaries and the price of petrol, but there were also a number of issues. There was a lot of controversy, for example, over resource control, conflicts between the executive arm of government and the legislature, which just went on and on and on. I mean, 2 Senate presidents were impeached and 1 Speaker of the House during Obasanjo's time in office. There was also this unfortunate rise in ethnic conflicts during his first term. So when his second term came about, it was just time for serious reform. Obasanjo's economic reform literally saw Nigeria freed from any foreign debts, and his policies boosted the private sector. He privatized government-owned enterprises across all sectors of the economy, but this came with a lot of controversy. Records show that during his 8 years in office, the country witnessed severe human rights abuses, while some people credit him as the architect of organized corruption. Why? Well, all of the properties and companies of the government that were privatized seem to have been auctioned off at ridiculous prices. So, as you can imagine, there are several allegations of abuse of office leveled against him. The 2007 elections in particular, which saw Musa Yar'adua come in, were described by both foreign and local observers as well below any modern democratic standards. And that's because, according to foreign observers, these elections were the most flawed in Nigeria's electoral history. Allegedly, the PDP took advantage of state apparatus, and we're talking about government-owned media houses, security agencies, and INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, right, that controls the elections. To cut a long story short here, what we're talking about is electoral malpractice and falsified results. And an election monitoring group that had over 50,000 observers around the country in those 2007 elections literally came out in its report to say that the elections were so flawed that they genuinely couldn't have met any standard whatsoever. There's no doubt that OBJ had his flaws, but a lot of people do believe that his strong will earned Nigeria a lot of respect internationally, and his military experience helped to sustain democratic rule at a time when the military was still so strong in the country. And he also led a renaissance of probably what was the best class of relatively young, well-educated and brilliant technocrats that served as ministers, commissioners, and other government appointees. Up next is Umaru Musa Yar'adua, who, by the way, won the 2007 elections with 70% of the vote. The first time an elected civilian head of state was handing over to another, so very significant elections historically for Nigeria. A bit of background information on him. So he was born into an elite Fulani family in Katsina State. His father was a federal minister during the First Republic from 1960 to 66, and his older brother, Shehu Musa Yar'adua, served in the military government from 1976 to 79. So Umaru Musa Yar'adua himself got into politics in 1989 as a mobilizer at first under the People's Redemption Party. Now, this was also when the transition program to restore civilian rule in Nigeria had started ahead of the 1993 elections. He then ran for governor of his state in 1999, and he served in office for 2 terms. As state governor, he developed a reputation for being financially prudent, accumulating a $50 million surplus in the state treasury. And as president, he was faced with the task of building on what Obasanjo had started. He was only in office for 3 years, by the way, which we'll get into shortly. Under his short reign, he reversed the fraudulent sale of government assets that had happened under the Obasanjo administration. And he also calmed tensions in the Niger Delta when he invited militants in the region to Aso Rock, starting an amnesty program and encouraging them to lay down arms. This was a major move. As we established in the first episode, there's no love really lost between the North and the South. But Yar'Adua's actions were pretty much a much-needed olive branch that showed him as a unifier, let's say. He also started some infrastructural projects, including the Abuja Metro Line, the Abuja-Kaduna Rail, and the dredging of the River Niger bank. And he was also keen on electoral reform. Contradictory though, because the 2007 elections that saw him become president were far from free and fair. If this government sounds too good to be true, then maybe that's because it actually is. President Yar'Adua's government was not without any controversy. For example, news that the Attorney General and Minister of Justice at the time, Michael Awanduaka, was allegedly compromised in a $182 million bribery scandal involving American engineering and construction company Halliburton, and a contract to build a liquefied natural gas plant on Bonny Island, which is in the Niger Delta region. Anyway, even though no Halliburton officials were charged or convicted, in 2009, a subsidiary of the company called KBR agreed to pay a $402 million fine, agreeing to having bribed Nigerian officials. And then Halliburton then paid an extra $177 million to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission for this fraudulent deal, although they still didn't admit to any wrongdoing, by the way. Under Yar'Adua, there were also allegations of an electricity scam. Government officials and private individuals were accused of embezzling billions of dollars that were intended for energy infrastructure in the country. No surprises there. There were also accusations of widespread corruption in the allocation of oil blocks and contracts in the oil and gas sector as well. I must say, though, these allegations weren't unique to the Yar'Adua administration. They've been long-standing issues in Nigeria's polity for a very long time. President to president, administration to administration. Musical chairs. Then in November 2009, things changed for the Yar'Adua administration. The former president went to Saudi Arabia apparently to treat heart and kidney problems, and he was absent for several weeks. As you can probably imagine, there were these intensifying calls for the vice president at the time, Goodluck Jonathan, to step in because there was this power vacuum in the country. But a court ruled that Yar'Adua wasn't obliged to hand power over while out of the country for medical treatment. Fast forward to February 9th, 2010, and the National Assembly voted for Jonathan to come in as acting president until Yar'adua could return to public office. So Jonathan agreed to do this, and even though we were told that Yar'adua came back to Nigeria on the 24th of February, Jonathan stayed in office and was to do so until the president was fit to resume. Unfortunately, this never happened. President Umar Musa Yar'adua passed away on the 5th of May 2010, and Jonathan succeeded him. You see, a lot of people have saluted Yar'adua for taking bold decisions and being a man of integrity. However, and unfortunately with his time cut short, we never really got to see the full potential of what he could achieve. May he rest in peace. Now, let's get into the Goodluck Jonathan era. A bit of background first. President Goodluck Jonathan is actually a zoologist. He got involved with the People's Democratic Party in the late 1990s, and in 1999, when Nigeria returned to democracy, he was elected as Bayelsa State's deputy governor, a position that he held until 2005, by the way, when he leveled up to state governor after his principal that we spoke about was impeached and charged with corruption. Then he was chosen as Yar'adua's running mate in the 2007 elections, won, and yeah. So fast forward to the passing of Musa Yar'adua and Jonathan taking office. First of all, there was a lot of speculation because Jonathan declared his intent to run in the 2011 elections not long after getting into the office of the president. You see, the PDP had been rotating presidential power between the predominantly Christian South and predominantly Muslim North. So Obasanjo, a Christian from the South, was in office for 8 years, but Yar'adua, a Muslim from the North, only served for 3 years before he passed away in 2010. Many believe that the North was still owed another term in office, but Jonathan won his party's 2011 primaries and he was elected as the PDP's presidential candidate. Then he was victorious in the elections, winning 59% of all valid votes that were cast. Now, a lot of young people actually campaigned and clamored for President Jonathan, as his rags to riches, no shoes story was actually one that people could empathize with. President Jonathan's full first term in office was dominated by the rise of terrorism in Nigeria's northeast. Boko Haram has been around since the late 90s and early 2000s, but until 2009, the group seemed to go about its operations in a more peaceful and less radical manner. In 2011, it was reported that at least 21 people died and several more were left injured when the terrorist organization bombed the UN head office in Abuja. In another attack on the capital in 2013, security forces were literally caught in a shootout with Boko Haram members near a residential compound housing lawmakers. And then in 2014, 276 schoolgirls were kidnapped in an area called Chibok in Borno State in the middle of the night. Attacks had been so widespread in the Northeast at this time, but this in particular sent shockwaves around the world, because how do 276 girls get kidnapped so easily from their dormitories in the middle of the night? The worst part is the girls couldn't be rescued until today. 98 are still in Boko Haram captivity. In 2014, the same year of the kidnappings, 57 of the girls managed to escape, and then in 2018, 107 were released. And then a year after, in 2019, 3 of the girls were rescued, 2 in 2021, and 9 last year in 2022. Insecurity is certainly one downfall of the Jonathan administration, but his administration is also linked to several corruption scandals. Another high-profile scandal of his administration was a $2.1 billion arms procurement scandal, where it was revealed that money that was intended for the procurement of weapons to fight Boko Haram had actually been embezzled by government officials and private companies. Another downer on the Jonathan administration is the signing in of a law in 2014 banning same-sex marriage and criminalizing homosexuality, with penalties of up to 14 years in jail. All this has done is make members of the LGBTQI community in Nigeria unsafe, and it seems no government is ready to reverse it. But over here on Polity, we are all about balance. I mean, President Jonathan did record some achievements. He revived the railway sector, even though, there's still a long way to go, and electoral reform too, because honestly, the Independent National Electoral Commission was pretty much that independent under Jonathan, I have to say. That's why INEC could introduce technologies like the card readers and the biometric IDs of voters that cut down on electoral fraud. There were also legislations like the Freedom of Information Act that Jonathan did sign into law to encourage a transparent government. I mean, even though they still decline your request like most of the time. And in terms of the economy, I mean, there were some periods of growth and development under Jonathan, but also serious challenges too. During his tenure, GDP grew at an average rate of about 6% a year, driven mainly by the oil and gas sector. But this growth wasn't inclusive, and the majority of Nigerians didn't benefit from it. Unemployment and poverty rates remained high. There was also a lack of diversification and infrastructure under Jonathan, particularly in terms of power and transport, which hindered growth. I mean, I know I said that he helped to revive the rail, but Nigeria is a country of over 200 million people. There's a lot of infrastructure that's needed, and there just wasn't enough done under Jonathan. Oh, and one thing that I do think is quite important when it comes to Jonathan is that when he lost the 2015 elections, and yes, he ran for another term, he peacefully handed power over to Muhammadu Buhari, and that's something that we hadn't really seen before. It was also the first time that an opposition candidate had won the presidential elections in the country against an incumbent. You know, speaking of Jonathan, it's actually got me thinking, like, we should really do an episode on First Ladies at some point, or maybe not. And now it's time for the President Buhari chapter. No, producer, I can't do this again. I can't do this again, no. I can't speak about him again.
You got this.
He's taken us into a recession twice. Like, my brain cannot process it anymore.
Just breathe. Foresight. Breathe.
Oh my God, I can't speak about Buhari again.
Let it breathe. Breathe. You got this. Let's go.
I'm running out of tea here. Chapter 2, actually, because, I mean, he was military head of state from 1983 to 1985 before being overthrown by a faction of mid-level armed forces officers led by the chief of army staff at the time, Major General Ibrahim Babangida. Remember, musical chairs. Have you ever heard of the word Buharism? It's pretty much linked to the authoritarian policies of his first regime, and Nigeria went into a recession then, the same way Nigeria went into a recession again in 2016, with him as president. I guess lightning can indeed strike twice. Where do we even start? Because this just feels like one long story. I mean, I can't lie. How old was I in 2015? 18 years old? Like, I had just started uni studying politics and international relations, fed up with the extreme corruption in Nigeria under the Jonathan administration. And honestly, like, I don't know if I should admit this on camera because I know it's going to come back to bite me. In 2015 then, I did not know much about Nigeria's history, I must say, and I thought that Buhari was the better option. Like, what was I thinking? I actually just shake my head when I think about it because I know I was young and I wasn't as aware as I am now. I actually thought this guy would put an end to corruption. Meanwhile, Nigeria now ranks 154th out of 180 countries according to the 2021 Transparency International Corruptions Perception Index. Like, it's wild. Buhari had also run for president several times. He ran in 2003, he ran in 2007, and he ran in 2011. Yeah, before then running again in 2015, and then that's when he finally came into office. Kind of reminds me of that guy that keeps chasing the hot babe, and then when she finally agrees, he now lets himself go, grows a tummy, and pretty much does the opposite of all of the promises that he made. So, Buhari and his party, the All Progressives Congress, win the 2015 elections. While campaigning, he promised to end Boko Haram, but terrorism has continued over the past 8 years. In fact, Nigeria has become so insecure, from terrorists to bandits that have kidnapped hundreds of school children, yet, and get this, receive amnesty from the government as well as paid ransoms. Like, what? I guess, unlike what we saw in all of those Hollywood movies, we do negotiate with terrorists. The 20th of October 2020 also happened under President Buhari's watch, where NSAS protesters were, allegedly, killed at the popular Lekki tollgate, and this is one of the darkest moments in Nigeria's history. To be fair though, back to the insecurity topic, the Buhari administration has been able to regain control of certain areas that terrorists were fully controlling under the Jonathan administration. But there's so much more that Nigeria is dealing with now than just one terrorist group. And quite frankly, it seems like there's just been no progress at all. Just last year in June 2022, innocent people attending church service on a Sunday were literally massacred and mauled to death in Awa, Ondo State. And we later found out that Boko Haram were responsible for the attack. So this is no longer just a northern problem. Insurgency is now like Oprah. Every geopolitical zone across Nigeria gets some. So what has the Buhari administration achieved? Even though Boko Haram hasn't been defeated like he promised when he was campaigning ahead of the 2015 elections, there has been significant progress in the fight against the sect. The group has been significantly weakened, and to be fair, the number of Boko Haram attacks have reduced, even though, on the other hand, there's been this rise in banditry under the Buhari administration. The Buhari administration has also, to be fair, done quite a lot in terms of infrastructure, and there have been efforts to diversify the economy away from oil and gas. Positive strides have been made, for example, in the agricultural sector. Buhari's presidency ends in 2023, and whoever Nigeria's next president is, they'll be inheriting 77 trillion naira in debt, a 33% unemployment rate, which could be higher, by the way, because we are yet to get unemployment figures for 2021, and 133 million citizens living in poverty. Didn't Buhari once say that he was going to end poverty in Nigeria? It's such a difficult yet delicate task because Nigeria simply can't afford another term of unproductive leadership. The country has never, ever been this fragile since returning to democracy in 1999. I mean, tensions are high in literally every corner. What can I say? Vote wisely. I mean, we cannot afford to sacrifice Nigeria's future. According to data, voter turnout in Nigeria has consistently reduced since 2003. Take a look at these figures. Only half of the number of people who voted in 2003 voted in 2019. Of course, the difficult process of getting a PVC is a key reason why, but many people also just haven't picked up their PVCs even though they've been ready for collection. Now that you know all of this, the decision of the next president solely relies on you. In the words of Mortal Kombat, choose your destiny.